The night it all started, the air was thick with the quiet of suburbia. The neighborhood slept in the kind of peace you only find in gated communities, where the most exciting event of the week was someone forgetting to take their recycling bin out on Tuesday. I had moved here for that calm, the illusion of safety and control that people like Karen Whitmore sold to newcomers like me when they flaunted their perfect, law-run streets. From the moment I moved in 2 years ago, I knew Karen was a problem. She lived 3 houses down, in a 2-story cream-colored monstrosity with hedges trimmed to military precision and a flagpole she saluted every morning like clockwork. She had the blonde bob, the oversized sunglasses, and the entitled swagger that screamed trouble. The first time we spoke, she wasn't even welcoming me, she was issuing a warning. "We don't like non-standard paint colors here," she had said, her eyes scanning my moving truck. "Keep that in mind." At first, I brushed her off. People like Karen existed in every neighborhood. Busybodies with nothing better to do than write passive-aggressive notes and gossip about people's lawn heights. But as the weeks turned into months, the complaints started rolling in. The first notice came because my lawn wasn't uniformly green. A drought had scorched a few patches of grass, and apparently, that was a violation. The second was because my trash bin was visible from the street. The third claimed my mailbox was the wrong shade. I had beige, but apparently, the community-approved color was antique cream, whatever that meant. I paid the fines, mowed the lawn, and tried to keep my head down. I worked long hours as an assistant district attorney in the city and had no patience for suburban politics. But Karen wasn't satisfied with compliance, she wanted control. Things escalated the moment I submitted plans for a detached garage. I needed the space. Between my car, my wife's SUV, and my motorcycle, the driveway was always crowded. I filed for permits, got approval from the city, and hired a licensed contractor. Everything was by the book. But Karen, self-appointed queen of the WA, went ballistic. At the next WA meeting, she stood up in her pastel cardigan and practically spat my name. "That garage is an eyesore," she screeched, slamming her binder on the table. "It violates the aesthetic harmony of this community. We cannot allow this to stand." I calmly pointed out that the city had approved it, and there was nothing in the WA bylaws prohibiting a detached garage. That only fueled her rage. She started sending me daily violation notices for ridiculous things: a leaf in my gutter, a flower bed out of alignment, even a citation because my dog barked during the mail delivery. By then, the neighborhood was divided. Some people sympathized with me, tired of Karen's reign of terror. Others were too afraid to speak up, worried they'd be her next target. I ignored her tantrums, kept my focus on my job, and reminded myself that bullies only win when you give them power. And then came that night. It was a warm Friday evening in early summer. I had stayed late at the office, reviewing files for an upcoming trial. By the time I got home, the neighborhood was quiet. I poured myself a drink, fed my dog, and settled into bed just after midnight. The shrill beeping of my smoke alarm tore me out of sleep. At first, I thought it was a malfunction, maybe a dead battery. But then I smelled it. Acrid, sharp, burning. I bolted upright, my heart pounding as adrenaline surged through me. The air was thick with smoke. I stumbled out of bed, coughing, and ran down the hallway. Flames were already licking the walls of my living room, a violent orange glow spreading across the hardwood floor. "Duke!" I screamed for my dog, my voice hoarse. I heard his frantic barking from the kitchen and followed the sound, shoving through the smoke until I found him huddled by the back door. I grabbed his collar, yanked the door open, and pushed him outside. The heat was unbearable, suffocating. My hands shook as I dialed 911, my voice cracking as I gave the dispatcher my address. "My house is on fire, please, you have to hurry." Minutes felt like hours. I stood barefoot in my driveway, clutching my dog, watching as the fire devoured everything I owned. The roof caved in with a deafening crash, sparks shooting into the night sky like fireworks. My neighbors started to gather, drawn by the chaos. Faces illuminated by the blaze stared in stunned silence. By the time the fire trucks arrived, there was nothing left to save. They fought the flames for an hour, but the damage was total. When the smoke finally cleared, my home was a skeleton of blackened beams and ash. I sat on the curb, numb, while an EMT wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and checked my vitals. The fire chief approached, his expression grim. "We'll have investigators out here in the morning," he said quietly. "But I can tell you right now, this wasn't an accident." His words sliced through the haze. What do you mean? I asked, though deep down, I already knew. There's a clear pattern, he explained. The fire started outside, near your garage. We found traces of accelerant. Someone wanted this house gone. My stomach dropped, and in that moment, there was only one name that came to mind. Karen. She'd been escalating for months, growing bolder and angrier. Just 2 days earlier, at another HOA meeting, she'd screamed at me in front of everyone. "You'll regret that garage," she'd shrieked. "I'll make sure it burns to the ground." The next morning, investigators combed through the ruins. My neighbor, an older man named Frank, walked over as they worked. He looked uneasy, scratching the back of his neck. "Mark," he said, "I don't know if this helps, but my security camera caught something last night." I followed him to his house, my pulse thundering in my ears. On his screen, grainy footage played. Karen, in her ridiculous pink tracksuit and white sneakers, creeping around my driveway just after midnight. In one hand, a flashlight. In the other, a gas can. The detective didn't need more proof. She was arrested 2 days later, charged with arson, destruction of property, and reckless endangerment. The neighborhood buzzed with whispers, some shocked, others saying they weren't surprised. As for me, I stood in the ruins of what used to be my home, trying to process the surreal nightmare I'd been thrown into. Everything I'd worked for, gone in one night because of a petty, vindictive woman drunk on power. But what Karen didn't know, what no one in the neighborhood knew, was that justice wasn't just a word to me. It was my profession, because I wasn't just Mark Jacobs, quiet homeowner and victim of arson. I was Assistant District Attorney Mark Jacobs. And in 1 week, when Karen walked into that courtroom, she wouldn't be facing just a judge. She'd be facing me. The morning of the hearing arrived with an eerie calm that felt almost staged, like the quiet before a storm. The courthouse steps were lined with reporters and gawkers, their cameras flashing as I strode up the marble stairs in my navy blue suit, a leather briefcase in hand. Every click of my shoes echoed like a drumbeat, steady and deliberate. I wasn't here as a victim anymore. I was here as the prosecutor. Karen Whitmore had been out on bail for the past week, and from what I'd heard, she'd been parading around the neighborhood like nothing had happened. She was still barking orders at people, still acting like she was untouchable, like burning my home to the ground was just another neighborhood dispute she could talk her way out of. She didn't realize that this courtroom wasn't her kingdom, it was mine. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation. Local residents filled the benches, some here out of loyalty, others just for the drama. A few of them offered me encouraging nods as I passed, their eyes filled with something like relief. Karen's reign of terror had lasted years, and for most of them, they'd never had the courage or the evidence to fight back. She was already seated at the defense table when I walked in, wearing a pastel blue blazer and a smug little smirk. Her blonde bob was perfectly styled, makeup flawless, as if this were some sort of fashion show rather than an arraignment for felony arson. When our eyes met, she tilted her head and smiled sweetly, like this was all some kind of misunderstanding. I ignored her and took my place at the prosecutor's table, setting down my files in a neat stack. I had every piece of evidence we needed, the footage from Frank's security camera showing her skulking through my driveway with the gas can, the chemical analysis of the accelerants found at the scene, the witness statements from neighbors who had heard her shouting threats at HOA meetings. It was airtight. The judge entered, and the bailiff called the room to order. The murmurs died instantly as everyone stood, and the weight of the moment settled in like a heavy cloak. State versus Karen Whitmore, the clerk announced. Karen's attorney, a thin man with slicked back hair and an expensive suit that screamed, paid in desperation, stood and started spouting the usual lines, how his client was a respected member of the community, how this was all a tragic misunderstanding, how there was no direct proof linking her to the fire. I waited, silent and composed, until it was my turn. Then I rose, buttoning my jacket with calm precision, and walked to the center of the courtroom. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady but sharp, "this isn't a misunderstanding. This is a case of deliberate, malicious arson committed by a woman who believed her position in the community made her untouchable. But the evidence will show otherwise." I clicked the remote in my hand, and the big screen at the side of the courtroom lit up with the first piece of evidence, Frank's security footage. Gasps rippled through the spectators as the grainy but unmistakable figure of Karen appeared, flashlight in hand, gas can swinging casually at her side as she prowled my driveway. Karen's smirk faltered for the first time. I zoomed in, frame by frame. "This is the defendant at approximately 12:43 a.m., less than 20 minutes before my home, and everything in it, was consumed by flames. The footage played through, showing her pouring something along the side of the garage, then jogging back down the street. It was damning. Her attorney objected, sputtering something about the video being circumstantial, but the judge waved him off. Next came the forensic report. I handed copies to the judge and jury, walking them through the analysis. The accelerant found at the scene matched the brand sold at the local hardware store. A store receipt with Karen's credit card and signature timestamped just hours before the fire sealed the deal. She didn't just threaten to burn my house down, I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal calm. She planned it. She bought the tools. She executed her plan. And she risked the lives of everyone nearby when she did it. The jury's faces were a mix of shock and disgust. Then came the testimonies. Frank took the stand first, visibly nervous but determined. I didn't want to get involved at first, he admitted, voice trembling. But I knew what I saw on that camera. It was her. No doubt about it. Several other neighbors followed, each one recounting their own run-ins with Karen, painting a picture of a woman who had bullied, harassed, and intimidated the entire community for years. One elderly couple told the court how she'd fined them $500 for having, improperly trimmed, rose bushes. Another neighbor revealed she had threatened to have their car towed for parking 2 inches over the curb. By the time they were done, Karen's reputation as the queen bee of the wall was in tatters. She sat there rigid, her hands gripping the edge of the table, her lawyer whispering furiously in her ear. Then it was my turn to take the stand. I walked to the witness box, placed my hand on the Bible, and took the oath. Sitting down, I looked straight at the jury. I've spent my career prosecuting criminals, I said, my voice steady. But never did I imagine that the person who would try to destroy my life would be someone I saw every day. Someone who waved at me while I walked my dog. Someone who thought burning my house to the ground was justified because I didn't follow her rules. I recounted that night in detail, the sound of the smoke alarm, the choking haze of smoke, the panic as I searched for my dog, the helplessness as my home burned to ash. My voice cracked once, just once, when I spoke about the photographs and family heirlooms I'd never get back. But I didn't let her see me break. By the time I stepped down, there wasn't a soul in that room who doubted her guilt. Karen's attorney tried a last-ditch effort to paint her as a passionate community leader who made a terrible mistake, but the jury wasn't buying it. They didn't take long to deliberate. Less than 2 hours later, they filed back into the courtroom. On the charge of first-degree arson, the foreman said, his voice clear and unwavering, "We find the defendant guilty." A collective exhale swept through the room. Karen's face went white, her lips trembling as the reality of the verdict sank in. The judge set sentencing for the following week, but everyone knew what was coming: years in prison. As the bailiff led her away in handcuffs, our eyes met one last time. Gone was the smugness, the superiority. In its place was raw fear. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed, microphones shoved in my face, questions flying. I kept my answers brief. Justice was served today, I said simply. No one, no matter who they think they are, is above the law. The weeks that followed were a blur of rebuilding. Insurance helped, but no amount of money could replace everything that had been lost. Still, there was a sense of peace in knowing she could never hurt anyone else again. The neighborhood began to heal. People started talking to one another again, helping each other with repairs, even organizing a small fundraiser for the things I'd lost. One evening, as I sat on the back porch of my temporary rental, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt something I hadn't in months: closure. Karen had tried to destroy me. But in the end, her arrogance had been her undoing. And as I watched the sky shift to shades of orange and pink, I realized something simple but powerful: you can rebuild a house. But the strength you find in surviving something like that stays with you forever.